She found warmth in a voice with no face and waged war on the one man she'd sworn to hate. The cruelest secret of all. They share the same heartbeat in the dark. Some loves wear the mask of an enemy. And we begin our story now. The 8th year corridors smelled of new mortar and old smoke, a contradiction the castle had not yet reconciled. Where the wall had fallen in May, the stone was paler, raw as a healing wound, and Hermione Granger pressed her palm against it sometimes without meaning to, the way one touches a scar to be sure it is real. She was doing exactly that, fingertips to the cool seam where ruin met repair, when his voice arrived behind her like a draft under a door. Sentimental, Granger? I'd have thought you'd want to forget this place ever cracked. She did not turn at once. She had learned the value of the held second, the breath kept in reserve. When she did face him, Draco Malfoy was leaning against the opposite wall with the studied looseness of someone who had rehearsed, looking unbothered until it calcified into habit. The afternoon light came thin through the high window and laid a grey edge along his jaw. He had grown into the sharpness of his own face this year. It did not soften him. It made him look like something carved to cut. Some of us remember on purpose, she said. It's how we make sure it doesn't happen twice. How noble! The word fell from him stripped of its meaning, a coin worn smooth. Tell me, does it exhaust you, carrying the whole conscience of the wizarding world? You walk like your spine's made of other people's expectations. And you walk like you're waiting for the floor to forgive you for standing on it. That landed. She watched it land. A flicker at the corner of his mouth, gone before it finished forming, and then the deliberate whitening of his knuckles, where his hand closed around the strap of his bag. He did not reach for his wand. That was new this year, the not reaching. A whole grammar of restraint he'd had to learn the hard way. McGonagall's put us together, he said instead, flat, as though the words cost him something to set down. The warding assignment, arithmetic lattice for the East Wing. She seems to think the two of us in a room is a punishment that fits some crime of mine. It's a punishment that fits both of us, Hermione said. I didn't ask for it either. No, you never ask. You simply arrive, correct everyone, and call it help. She felt the heat climb her throat and hated that he could put it there. 7 o'clock, she said. The Arithmancy Tower. Bring your own ink. I'm not lending you mine. Wouldn't dream of touching anything of yours, Granger. He pushed off the wall and walked away, robes swallowing the sound of him, and she stood with her hands still flat against the new stone and the old, telling herself the tremor in it was the cold. That was the war by daylight. It had its own weather, its own hours, its predictable fronts. She could have mapped it. She had, in fact, in the private cartography of her resentment. Every contour of him she found contemptible. Every place she expected the assault and braced for it. There was a terrible comfort in an enemy you understood. You always knew where to stand. What she could not have mapped was the dark. The mirror had come to her in October, the first week McGonagall revived the old charm. They had been laid out in the great hall under candlelight, 24 of them on black velvet, each one a disc of glass so dark it seemed to drink the flames rather than reflect them. Correspondence glasses, the headmistress had called them, in that voice that brooked no nonsense, and somehow beneath it ached. They were used after the First War. The castle has always known how to make strangers speak when neighbors could not. The rules were simple and absolute. You did not know your partner. The glass altered the voice, lowered it, smoothed it, took the fingerprints off it, so that nothing of the speaker's true self survived the crossing, but the shape of their thoughts. You did not seek to discover their identity. The point, McGonagall said, was to learn to trust a person you could not place in any of your inherited categories. To meet a mind with no face attached, no house, no surname, no blood. To find out, perhaps, what you sounded like when you had nothing to defend. Hermione had thought it sentimental. She had thought it, frankly, a little desperate. The gesture of a school trying to stitch its children back together with thread too fine for the wound. She had been wrong about almost all of it. The first night she'd held the glass in both hands and felt foolish. A girl talking to a black coin in the privacy of her dormitory, while Lavender's old bed stood empty across the room. "Hello," she'd said, and felt the word evaporate. And then the glass had warmed against her palms, and a voice had answered out of the dark. "Hello." A pause, waited. "I confess, I don't know how this is meant to begin. Do we exchange pleasantries, compare our crimes?" The voice was low and even and entirely strange. The charm had done its work, sanding away whatever it had been before. But something in the cadence had a dry, careful precision, the rhythm of a person who chose words the way a duelist chooses ground. "We could just talk," she'd said, "like people who don't owe each other anything." "I'm not sure I know how to do that," the voice said. "Owe nothing. It sounds like a foreign country." "Then we'll learn the language together." There had been a silence, but not an empty one. A silence with texture, the held breath of someone deciding whether to trust the floor. Then, "All right, I'm called Cenarius, apparently. The glass chose it. Yours?" The rules forbade her name. She'd looked for something true that gave nothing away. "Call me Sortis," she'd said. "The drawing of lots, fate by chance." "Sortis," he'd repeated, and she'd heard something in the altered voice she could not name. A small, sharp intake, as though the word had cost him a step backward. What Hermione could not know, what only the dark itself knew, and the boy holding the twin glass 3 floors away in the cold green hush of the Slytherin dormitory, was that the charm hid the voice, but not the words. And the words were hers. He had known her in the first 3 sentences. Draco had sat very still on the edge of his bed, with the black disk burning faintly in his hands, and the recognition had gone through him like cold water poured down the spine. We could just talk, like people who don't owe each other anything. No one else in the castle spoke like that. That reflexive reach for fairness, for the clean ledger, even with a stranger, especially with a stranger. The phrasing was a fingerprint the charm could not file off. It was her. It was Granger. He had been assigned, by some appalling arithmetic of fate, the one person in the world who would sooner curse him than share a corridor. And the glass had made her speak to him as though he were a blank page she might, with care, write something gentle upon. He should have ended it. There was a way to request reassignment. He knew there was. He had drafted the words in his head, "I'm not suited to this. Find me another." And they had sat in his mouth like stones, and he had not said them. Because she had said, "We'll learn the language together," and no one in the entire ruin of his life had ever offered to learn a language with him. They had only ever taught him theirs and punished his accent. So he had given her a false name and let her give him one in return, and he had told himself it was harmless. This single night, this one stolen hour where she did not know to hate him. He had told himself that for 7 nights now, it was no longer 1 hour. It was the hour he waited for through every grey waking minute of the day, through the arithmancy and the cold dining hall and the corridors where she looked at him as if he were a stain the castle hadn't scrubbed out yet. He carried 2 versions of her now, and the cost of it was beginning to show in the half-moons under his eyes that even Pansy had remarked upon. By daylight, Granger despised him with a thoroughness he had, he knew, earned to the last drop. By dark, Sortis told Cenarius things she had told no living soul. That night, the night after the corridor, the new stone, the floor forgive you for standing on it, the glass warmed late. She'd lain awake waiting for it, ashamed of the waiting. "You're quiet tonight," the voice said. "Has the world been unkind?" She almost laughed. "There's a person here I'm forced to work with. There's a great deal of history, none of it good." In the green dark, 3 floors below, Draco's hand tightened on the glass until the rim bit into his palm. "Tell me about him," Cenarius said, and his altered voice came out steady, betraying nothing. "If it helps, I won't repeat it. I don't have anyone to repeat it to." She drew her knees up under the blanket. The candle had burned to a stub, and the flame leaned and recovered, throwing the room into a slow rhythm of gold and shadow. "He's cruel," she said. "Or he was. I keep waiting to catch him being cruel again, the way you keep your hand near a kettle you've been burned on. And the strange thing is, he keeps not doing it. He says vicious things, but he never quite. There's a place he stops now that he didn't used to stop, and I don't trust the stopping. I think I'd almost rather he was simply the monster I remember. It would be tidier." A long silence, the kind with texture. "Maybe," Cenarius said at last, and she heard the words come slow, each one set down like a man walking a frozen lake. "He stops because he's finally learned the weight of what he used to throw." "You sound very sure." "No," he said. "I'm not sure of anything. I only know that people can be more than one thing at once. That a person might—" The voice halted. 3 floors below, Draco shut his eyes. "Might hate the sound of his own voice in the daylight and only find it bearable in the dark with someone who doesn't know to flinch when he speaks." Hermione lay still. The candle leaned. Something had moved in the room that had nothing to do with the draft. "That's a very specific thing to say," she said softly. "Cenarius, who are you?" And in the green hush below, the boy who loved her held the glass against his mouth and could not, for the life of him, find a single word that would not damn them both. He did not answer the question. He could not. The silence stretched between the 2 glasses until it had a temperature of its own, and at last Draco set the words down sideways, the way a man slides past a door he cannot bear to open. "Someone you've never met," he said. "Someone who has no right to an opinion about your enemy and is going to offer one anyway. Don't trust the tidy version, Sortis. Monsters are comfortable precisely because they ask nothing of you. A person who's changed asks everything. He asks you to look again. That's the cruelty of it. The reformed are far more inconvenient than the wicked. She was quiet a long moment. 3 floors above him, in a room he could not picture without seeing the whole of her in it, Hermione turned the thought over the way she turned over a proof that almost worked. "You speak as though you've been on both sides of that door," she said. "I speak," he said carefully, "as someone who has disappointed people. That's all I'll say tonight." And because she had her own ledger of things she would not say tonight, she let him keep it. That was the unspoken treaty of the dark between them. Each was permitted 1 locked room, no questions asked at the threshold. It was the most generous arrangement she had ever been offered by anyone, and she did not yet understand why a stranger should be the one to offer it. The candle guttered. She watched the last of it drown in its own wax. "Good night, Cenarius." "Good night, Sortis." A pause, and then lower, as if he hadn't meant her to catch it. "Sleep without the kettle near your hand, just for tonight. Nothing's going to burn you in the dark." The glass cooled. She lay in the new black of the snuffed candle and pressed it to her sternum and felt the absurd, dangerous warmth of having been, for 1 hour, entirely unguarded with a man who had no face. The arithmancy tower at 7 was a different country. She arrived first, as she always did, and laid out her things with the precision of someone fortifying a position. Ink on the left, fresh parchment squared to the table's edge, her reference texts in a fan of leather and gilt. The room was round and cold, its single tall window giving onto a sky the colour of wet slate, and the great brass orrery in the corner ticked through its slow planetary arithmetic with a sound like a patient heart. Malfoy came at 4 minutes past. She noted the 4 minutes. She noted everything about him in daylight. It was a habit of survival she had not unlearned. He set his own ink down on the right without a word, and for a moment they simply faced each other across the table like 2 countries that shared a contested border. "The lattice fails at the 3rd node," she said, dispensing with greeting. "Your figures from yesterday, the resonance frequency you chose for the eastern anchor stone, it harmonizes with the granite, but the granite there isn't load-bearing the way you assumed. It's been replaced. New stone. Different song." She watched the flicker cross his face. Not anger this time, but something quicker, the genuine attention of a mind that had been caught in an error and could not pretend otherwise. He pulled the parchment toward him and bent over it, and a strand of pale hair fell across his brow, and he did not push it back. "Show me," he said. She came around the table. It cost her something to stand at his shoulder, to be near enough to smell the cold iron and cedar of him, and set her fingertip on the figure. "Here. You assumed continuity of medium, but May broke the continuity. Half this wall is 6 months old, your harmonics singing to a stone that doesn't exist anymore." He was silent, then very low, almost to himself. "Of course it is. Nothing in this castle is what it was." His finger moved beside hers on the parchment, not touching, a hair's breadth of charged air between the 2 of them, and she became unbearably aware of the narrow distance and the way the brass orrery ticked and the way neither of them stepped back. "You'd have caught it eventually," she said, and was appalled to hear something almost like fairness in her own voice. He turned his head. He was very close. His grey eyes had the slate of the window in them. Would I, he said, or would I have spent 3 nights re-anchoring a wall to a ghost, too proud to ask the one person in this castle who'd have seen it in a glance? A muscle worked in his jaw. Don't be generous with me, Granger. I don't know what to do with it. I have a whole architecture built for your contempt. Kindness brings the scaffolding down. She stepped back then, because she had to, because the air between his finger and hers had grown too dense to breathe. It wasn't kindness, she said. It was accuracy. You happened to be on the receiving end. Naturally, he bent back to the figures. Accuracy, the Granger speciality. But his voice had lost its edge, and she heard it, and she hated that she heard it. And she sat back down across the border with her spine very straight and her hands not quite steady, reaching to align her already aligned parchment a half-inch to the left, as if the geometry of the table were the only thing in the world that needed correcting. They worked for 2 hours. It was the longest they had ever been in a room without drawing blood. When the orrery struck 9, he gathered his things in silence, and at the door he paused, his back to her. "The 3rd node," he said, not turning. "Thank you for the 3rd node." And he was gone before she could decide whether the world had tilted, leaving her alone with the ticking planets and the slate-coloured sky, and a small, treacherous warmth she did not have a category for. What she did not see, what the dark would never have allowed her to see in the brutal arithmetic of daylight, was what he did with that warmth once he was out of the tower. He carried it down through the changing castle like a man carrying water in cupped hands, terrified of spilling it. And that night, when the glass warmed in the green hush of the dungeon, he had to discipline the relief out of his voice before he spoke, because the relief was hers. The relief of having spent 2 hours near her without the war, and he could not let her hear how much it had meant, because Sortis did not know she had spent those hours with Cenarius at all. He had begun, in the days since, to protect her in ways she would never trace back to him. Small, invisible kindnesses smuggled through the seams of the school. When Theo Knott had started a low joke in the common room about Granger and her charity cases, Draco had cut him off with a single flat sentence, so cold the whole room went quiet, and no one understood why, least of all Theo. When he'd overheard, in the library, 2 7th years planning to bewitch her ink to bleed through her warding notes, he had quietly hexed the bottle dry himself and let them think it had simply run out. When the rebuilt staircase on the 4th floor developed a treacherous false step that the castle hadn't yet flagged, the kind of thing that could send a person who climbed it nightly straight down a flight of stone. He had spent a wordless hour after curfew on his knees with a binding charm, mending it, because he knew she took that staircase to the arithmantic tower, and he could not bear the image of her falling. He told no one. He took no credit. The credit would have required a name, and the name was the one thing he could not give her without losing the only place she had ever spoken to him gently. "You're different tonight," Sortis said into the dark. "Lighter. Did the world finally manage to be kind?" In the dungeon, he almost laughed at the precision of her instinct. "The enemy and I worked together today," he said, "without bloodshed. It was disorienting, like reaching for a step that isn't there and finding solid ground instead of the fall." She went very still in her bed, and and he did not know why, and he could not see the way her hand had drifted to her own sternum at the strange familiarity of the image. "That's funny," she said slowly. "I had almost the same day. My enemy and I, we managed 2 hours without a wound between us. And the worst part is, I keep wanting to take it apart, find the trick in it. It can't be that simple. People don't just stop being what they were." "No," he agreed, and the word cost him. "They don't just stop, but maybe they stop in front of one person at a time. Maybe being witnessed gently is the only thing that teaches a person there's a self they're worth being gentle with. A silence with texture. Maybe your enemy has never once, in his entire life, been spoken to the way you've spoken to me these past weeks. I don't speak to him that way." "No," Cenarius said softly. "You don't. That's rather my point." She lay in the dark and felt the strangest pressure behind her ribs, an atmospheric weight, as though the room had filled with the charged stillness that comes before a storm finally breaks over a valley that has waited too long for rain. "Cenarius," she said, "why does it feel sometimes as though you know me, as though you knew me before the glass?" In the dungeon, the boy who loved her closed his eyes and let the lie come out gently, because the truth would have ended everything, and he was not ready. He would never be ready for the dark to go silent. "Because you let me," he said. "Because you've shown me more of yourself in these hours than most people see of you in years. Of course, I know you, Sortis. You've spent weeks teaching me how." He swallowed. "It's the cruelest thing, actually, to know someone in the dark this well and to have no right to them in the light." "What if you did?" she said, and her own daring frightened her, the candle long dead, her voice small in the black. "What if you turned out to be someone I could have in the light too? Would you tell me who you are?" The glass burned against his palm. 3 floors above, she waited, her whole heart pressed against the question. And in the green hush below, Draco Malfoy opened his mouth to answer her, and the answer that rose in him was a name. His name. The one name in the world that would turn every gentle hour they had built into a weapon aimed at her trust. And he held it behind his teeth like a man holding a door against a flood, and the silence stretched and stretched, and she whispered, "Cenarius," into the dark, and still he did not let it go. "I'm here," he said at last, and the words came out roughened even through the charm's smoothing. "Forgive me. You asked me something I want to answer more than I've wanted anything, and that's exactly why I can't. Not yet. Not tonight." "That isn't an answer." "No. It's a promise that there is one, and that giving it to you wrongly would ruin it." He drew a breath she could hear, a long shape in the dark. "Let me ask you something instead. If you knew who I was, if it turned out the man behind this glass was someone the daylight had taught you to despise, would you go back and unhear everything I've said to you these past weeks? Would you call it all a trick?" Hermione lay very still. It was a strange question, oddly specific, and some careful part of her filed it away the way she filed away an equation that did not yet resolve. "I don't think I could unhear it," she said honestly. "That's the trouble. You can't unknow a person once they've let you in, even if you wanted to, even if knowing them turned out to be inconvenient." "Inconvenient," he repeated, And there was something in the altered voice that might have been a laugh and might have been the opposite of one. Yes, that's the word for it. The candle's stub had drowned an hour ago. She lay in the absolute dark of the snuffed room and found that she no longer needed the light to feel him there. The glass had become a kind of room of its own, windowless and warm, and she had begun. She admitted it to herself for the first time that night, lying with the cool disk against her breastbone, to live for the hour the door to that room opened. "Tell me a true thing," she said. "Something the daylight version of you would never say. We don't have to give names. Just one true thing, so I know the dark is real." A long silence, then very low. "When I was a child," Cenarius said, "my father taught me that the worst thing a person could be was ordinary. That to be loved, you had to be exceptional, pure, perfect, untouchable. So I built myself into something untouchable. And it worked, in a way. People feared me. Some of them even admired me. But no one ever once reached for me in the dark the way you do, because there was nothing to reach for. I'd made certain of that. I'd sanded every handhold off myself." A pause, and the next words came so quietly she had to still her breath to catch them. "You're the first person who ever spoke to the part of me my father told me to bury. And the terrible thing is, you don't even know you're doing it. You'd be horrified if you knew who you were doing it to." The pressure behind her ribs returned, that storm stillness that held breath of the air before rain. She did not understand why his words landed in her the way they did, as though some part of her recognized the shape of the wound he was describing, recognized it from a face she saw in daylight and could not bear. "I'd like to meet the part of you no one reached for," she whispered. "I think I already have." In the dungeon 3 floors below, Draco Malfoy pressed the heel of his hand to his eyes and held the glass to his chest and said nothing for a long time, because if he had spoken in that moment, his voice would have broken in a way no charm could disguise. The East Wing lattice was failing in a new place, and McGonagall summoned them both to her office to explain why. It was the kind of meeting that under ordinary circumstances would have been a battlefield. Granger and Malfoy made to account jointly for a shared failure, each primed to lay the blame across the border. Hermione walked up the spiral stair braced for it, her arguments arranged like soldiers. But Malfoy was already there when she arrived, standing at the window with his back to the room, and when McGonagall said in that voice like a blade in a velvet sheath, "The eastern anchor has shifted again. I am told the harmonic was miscalculated. I should like to know by whom." Hermione opened her mouth to explain the granite, the new stone, the broken continuity. To be accurate, to be fair, to apportion the error where it honestly lay, which was, she knew, partly with both of them. And Malfoy said, without turning from the window, "By me. Granger flagged the granite 3 days ago. I dismissed it. The error is entirely mine." The room went silent. The portraits on the walls leaned in. Hermione stared at the back of his pale head and felt the soldiers of her argument lower their weapons in confusion, because that was not what had happened. She had flagged the granite, yes, but he had corrected it. He had thanked her for the 3rd node. The shift in the lattice now was a new failure. Neither of them had caught, and he was lying. He was lying to take the whole of it onto himself, and she could not for the life of her work out why. "Is that so, Mr. Malfoy?" McGonagall said, and something passed behind her spectacles too quick to read. "It is. Granger's work has been faultless. I'd ask that the record reflect that." When they were dismissed, they descended the spiral stair in silence, and at the bottom, in the cold stone vestibule where the torches threw their restless light, she caught his sleeve. He stopped. He looked down at her hand on his arm, as though it were a thing he did not have a category for. "Why did you do that?" she said. "It wasn't true. You corrected the granite. The new failure is, it's both of us, or neither. Why would you take it?" For a moment, he said nothing. The torchlight moved over his face, gilding and ungilding it. "Because you have a future to protect, and I have a name to bury," he said at last. "One bad mark on your record matters. One more on mine is a drop in a flood. Let the ledger fall the way that costs the least." He gently removed her hand from his sleeve, not roughly, but with a care that undid her more than roughness would have. And he held it for half a second longer than the gesture required, his thumb passing once across her knuckles, and then he let go. "Don't make a study of it, Granger. You'll only find something you don't want to." He walked away down the torchlit corridor, his footsteps hollow on the old stone, and she stood in the vestibule with the hand he had touched held against her sternum, exactly where she held the glass each night. And a thought arrived in her so quietly and so completely that she could not afterwards say when it had begun, that he held my hand the way someone holds a thing he loves and has no right to. She put the thought away. It was too dangerous to keep out. That night, the glass warmed early, before she had even snuffed the candle, and she found she was glad of the light for once, glad of something to look at that was not the dark and the dangerous thoughts swimming in it. "You're troubled," Cenarius said. "I can hear it before you've said a word now. When did that happen? When did I learn the weather of you well enough to read it through a piece of glass?" "My enemy did something today," she said. "Something I can't account for. He took a punishment that wasn't his, to protect me. And then he held my hand and told me not to make a study of it, which is precisely the thing guaranteed to make me make a study of it." She drew her knees up. "Cenarius, I've spent years building a person out of him, brick by brick, every cruel thing he ever did, mortared into a wall I could see him behind. And lately he keeps stepping out from behind the wall, and I don't know what to do with the man who's standing in front of it. The wall's still there, but he's not behind it anymore. He's just out in the open, holding my hand, and I can't reconcile the two." In the dungeon, Draco sat with the glass burning in his palms and the most extraordinary ache spreading through his chest, because she was describing him to himself. She was describing the exact architecture of his own concealment, and she had no idea that the man in the dark she trusted and the man in the daylight she was dismantling were the same divided creature, two halves of one held breath. "Maybe," he said, and chose each word the way a man crosses a frozen lake. The wall was never the truth of him. Maybe the wall was the lie, and the man holding your hand is what was always underneath. And the only thing that's changed is that he's finally tired of defending a fortress that was empty all along. A silence. "What will you do if the man out in the open turns out to be real?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I'm afraid of him out in the open. The wall was safer. I knew where to stand. Yes, Cenarius said softly. I know exactly what you mean. The fortress is lonely, but at least inside it you can't be hurt by someone reaching in. A pause. Sortis, can I tell you something I've never told anyone and ask you not to look for the face behind it? Always. There's a person I see every day who doesn't know she's the reason I'm still here, still trying, still bothering to become someone less wretched than I was. She thinks I'm her enemy. She's right in the daylight. But in the dark, his voice fractured just slightly, the charm unable to smooth the break entirely. In the dark, I get to be the man I might have been if my father had taught me that being loved had nothing to do with being untouchable. And I'm so afraid, Sortis. I'm afraid that the day she finds out who I am, every gentle thing I've built with her in the dark will turn to ash in her hands, and she'll never know it was real, because the truth will look exactly like the cruelest trick I could have played. Hermione lay very still in the candlelight, her heart aching for this faceless man and the woman he loved and could not have, never once turning the words toward herself, never once letting the two daylight and darkness halves of her own strange autumn touch. And she said, Then you have to tell her, Cenarius, before she finds out some other way. A truth she discovers will always feel like a betrayal. A truth you give her freely is a gift. She paused. Trust her. If she's worth all this, trust her with the worst of it. And in the green hush 3 floors below, Draco Malfoy heard the woman he loved tell him, without knowing it, exactly how to break her own heart. And he set the glass down against his chest and stared at the low stone ceiling and understood with a cold and final clarity that the longer he waited, the deeper the wound would cut, and that he was, God help him, going to wait anyway, because he could not yet bear to lose the only door she had ever opened to him. The thaw did not hold. Thaws never do. They only teach the ground how badly it wants to freeze again. It happened in the library, in the long blue hour before dinner, when the rebuilt windows let in a light the colour of cold milk, and the dust hung suspended in it like things that had forgotten how to fall. Hermione was at the warding table with the lattice diagrams spread before her, and Malfoy was across from her, and for nearly an hour they had worked in the strange new peace that had grown between them like moss over a battlefield. Then, a 6th-year Hufflepuff, a small, earnest boy with ink on his fingers, had come to ask Hermione about a transfiguration problem, and she had answered him kindly, and the boy had said in the artless way of children who repeat what they've heard at home, "My mum says you're the bravest witch of the age. She says you and Harry Potter saved everyone." And then his eyes had drifted across the table to Malfoy, and the warmth had drained out of his small face, and he had said more quietly, "My mum says he's the reason my uncle didn't come home." The silence after was total. The dust hung in the cold light. Hermione watched Malfoy's hand close around his quill until the knuckles went white and the feather bent, and she watched him say nothing, not a word, not a defense, not the cruelty she would once have expected. And she watched the boy flush and stammer and flee, and she was left across the table from a man who had become, in the space of a single innocent sentence, a statue of himself. "Malfoy," she said. "Don't." The word was very low, Don't do the thing you're about to do. Don't be fair to me." The boy was right. His uncle didn't come home, and I wore the mark of the people who made sure of it. Fairness is the one thing I can't survive from you, Granger. I have a defense prepared for everything except being treated as though I might deserve mercy. And here was the place she had always stood. The old familiar border and the old reflex came up in her like a tide. Because he had given her an opening, he had bared the soft place, and a year ago she would have driven the blade straight into it without a thought. The cruelty was right there in her mouth, fully formed. "You're right. You don't deserve mercy. You never did." She had said worse to him. She had a whole arsenal. She said it. God help her. She said a version of it, because she was frightened. Frightened of the man out in the open. Frightened of the way her own chest had ached, watching the feather bend in his hand. Frightened of the thought she had put away in the torchlit vestibule and could not keep put away. And fear in Hermione Granger had always come out as a blade. "Maybe you don't," she said. "Maybe the boy's mother has it exactly right. Maybe no amount of warding charms and quiet good behavior buys back a single person who didn't come home. Maybe you should sit with that instead of fishing for someone to tell you you've suffered enough." She watched it land. She watched it go in clean and deep, watched the grey eyes go flat and the face close like a door. And for one vicious half-second, the old satisfaction rose in her. There, you knew where to stand. You're standing there now. And then it curdled instantly into something she had no name for, because he did not fight back. He simply gathered his diagrams with hands that were not quite steady, and stood and said, in a voice scraped down to nothing, "There it is. The Granger I built my fortress for. I'd started to think she'd gone. Stupid of me." And he left, and his footsteps were hollow on the library stone, fading down between the shelves into the cold blue dark. And Hermione sat alone in the suspended dust, and felt the satisfaction rot in her chest into pure, sick regret. She had won. She had stood where she always stood, and she had won, and it felt like having broken something in her own house. She did not understand the full size of what she had done until the glass stayed cold that night. It had never stayed cold. In all the weeks of the autumn, through every mood and weather, the glass had warmed, and Cenarius had come, and the windowless room had opened. But that night she lay with the black disk against her sternum, and it remained as cool as a stone from the bottom of a lake. And the hour came and went, and the next hour, and the candle drowned, and still the dark stayed silent. She told herself he was tired. She told herself there were nights one simply could not speak. But a fear had begun to move in her, low and cold, and somewhere near midnight she lifted the glass in both hands and whispered into it, "Cenarius, are you there? Please. I had a terrible day. I did a terrible thing. I need—" She stopped herself. "I need you." She had nearly said it to a man with no face. In the dungeon 3 floors below, Draco lay with the twin glass turned face down on the stone floor beside his bed, as far from his hands as he could put it without leaving the room. And he heard her. The charm carried her whether he held it or not, her voice rising thin and frightened out of the cold disk on the floor. And the sound of Sortis needing him, frightened after the daylight blade had gone into him so cleanly, was nearly more than the divided creature he had become could bear, because both of them were her. The blade in the library and the plea in the dark. And he understood, lying there with his back to the glass, and her voice spilling small and desperate across the dungeon floor, that this was the precise and exquisite torture the autumn had been building toward all along. That the same woman would wound him in the daylight and reach for him in the dark, and she would never know they were the same wound and the same hand. And he could not tell her which of him she had broken, because the breaking and the broken were one secret held behind one set of teeth. He did not pick up the glass. It was the only act of self-protection left to him, and it cost him everything he had. He lay with his back to her voice until it stopped. Until, near 1 in the morning, she gave a small sound that was almost a sob and went quiet. And then he lay a long while longer in the silence she had left behind, and his face was wet, and there was no charm in the world that could smooth that. The next day in the arithmancy tower, he did not come at all. She arrived at 7 and laid out her things in the old fortifying ritual, ink on the left, parchment squared, and she waited, and the brass orrery ticked through its planetary arithmetic, and the slate sky went from grey to charcoal to the deep bruise of early dark, and Malfoy did not come. At 8, she gathered her things. At the door she stopped, her hand on the cold iron ring, and stood for a long moment looking back at the empty room, at the chair across the contested border, empty, and felt the strangest grief, entirely out of proportion to a missed work session with a boy she had spent 6 years despising. It made no sense. She had what she had always wanted. The war by daylight had a clear front again. She had reasserted the border. The man had retreated behind his wall where she could see him and brace for him and know where to stand. This was the tidy version. This was the monster restored. She should have felt the cold comfort of it. Instead, she felt as though she had taken an axe to the only 2 warm rooms in the whole cold castle. The daylight one, where a boy had thanked her for the 3rd node and held her hand like a thing he loved and had no right to. And the dark one, where a faceless man had taught her what it was to be witnessed gently. And she could not, for the life of her, see that they were the same room, that the axe had been one axe, that the man she had silenced in the dark and the man she had driven from the tower were grieving in the same body 3 floors below her. His face turned to the wall. She walked back to Gryffindor through the changing corridors, past the pale new stone and the old, and on the 4th floor staircase she climbed the false step that had once been treacherous, the step that now held firm under her foot, mended by an hour of wordless work she would never trace to its source. And she did not even notice it hold, did not know it had ever threatened to drop her, did not know that the boy she had told to sit with his guilt had once knelt on these stones in the dark to make certain she would never fall. That night, she did not lift the glass to plead. Her pride would not survive a second's silence. She set it on the table beside her bed, face up, a black eye watching the ceiling, and she lay down and stared at it, and willed it to warm and despised herself for the willing. And near midnight, against every expectation, it warmed. She was on it before the heat had fully bloomed, her hand closing over the disk, and she did not say, "Where were you?" And she did not say, "I'm sorry," though both were clawing at her throat because she did not yet know how to be sorry to a man she had wronged in a body she could not see. She only said, "Cenarius," and the relief in the single word betrayed everything she had not said. There was a long silence. When he spoke at last, the altered voice was careful and very tired, a man walking a frozen lake who had already heard it crack once and did not trust it to hold. "I wasn't sure I should come tonight," he said. "I wasn't sure I had the right. I've been wrestling with something all day, and I think the wrestling has made me cruel by absence, and you didn't deserve the silence. Whatever you did yesterday, whatever the terrible thing was, you didn't deserve to reach into the dark and find no one there. I'm sorry for that, the not being there. It was the only way I knew to keep from saying something I can't take back. But it was a coward's way, and you've had enough cowards reach for you and then vanish." She lay very still. It was such a strange and specific absolution. Whatever you did yesterday, as though he knew the shape of her terrible thing without her having named it, as though her cruelty in the daylight and his silence in the dark had been two halves of one event. But she did not follow the thought to its end. She had built her own walls too, and one of them stood precisely there at the threshold of the question she could not afford to ask. "I hurt someone yesterday," she whispered instead. "Someone who'd stopped fighting me. I had the blade ready out of pure habit, and I used it because I was frightened of how I'd started to feel about him, and he didn't even raise a hand to stop it. He just let me. And then he looked at me like I'd proved something he'd been dreading, and then he was gone. And the worst of it, Cenarius, the very worst of it, is that I think I was crueler to him because I'd begun to care, as though the caring was a threat I had to put down before it grew. In the dungeon 3 floors below, Draco Malfoy lay with the glass against his sternum and her confession pouring into him. The confession that the blade had been fear, that the fear had been the beginning of caring, that she had wounded him because she had started to feel something. And he understood that she had just handed him, in the dark and without knowing it, the single most precious and most unbearable piece of knowledge of his entire life. That the girl who hated him in the daylight had begun, against her own will, to want him. And that he could not tell her he knew, could not reach across and gather her up, could not say, "It was me. It was me you wounded, and it was me you wanted, and we are the same. And it's all right. I forgive you. I forgave you before you'd finished." Because the moment he said any of it, the dark room would fill with the daylight, and the one place she had ever set her armor down would become the place she'd been most deceived. And so, he held the truth behind his teeth one more night, and he let the silence stretch, and into it he said only, very low, the thing that was true in both his bodies at once. Then care for him anyway. Care for him out loud before the fear has a time to sharpen the next blade. Trust me, Sortis. There is nothing on this earth a man like that wants more than to be cared for by the one person whose blade he never once thought to block. December came down on the castle like a held breath finally let go. Snow filled the broken places first. The pale new stone of the east wing wore it best, as though the cold had decided to forgive what the fire had done. And the corridors went hushed and white, and the candles burned longer against the early dark. Hermione tried. In the daylight, she tried. She came to the arithmancy tower the next evening, and the one after, and Malfoy came too, and they worked the lattice in a peace more fragile than before. A truce neither of them named, both of them moving carefully around the thing she had broken in the library, as though it were a pane of glass laid across the floor between them. She did not apologize in words. Her pride and her confusion would not let her find them. But she began to care out loud, as the dark had told her to, in small, mute ways, the only dialect she had. She left the better quill on his side of the table. She stopped squaring her parchment as a fortification and let it lie crooked, an offering of disorder. Once, when his hand cramped from the long figures, she pushed her own pot of ink across the border without a word, the pot she had once refused to lend him, and she watched him look at it for a long moment before he dipped his quill, and neither of them said anything, and the orrery ticked, and something passed between them that was warmer than language. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He had learned to read her in two bodies now, and the daylight half of her had begun, haltingly, to speak the tongue the dark half spoke so freely. And every small offering she pushed across the contested table was a knife turned slowly in him, because he knew what it cost her, knew she did not understand she was caring for the same man twice, knew that her tenderness in the light was the echo of advice he had given her in the dark, advice he had given knowing it would ripen into exactly this. And he received each offering like a man receiving water in a desert he had no right to be drinking from. The dark grew bolder in proportion. As the daylight truce stayed careful and mute, the nights spilled over. They talked now until the candles drowned and passed it, until the cold of the small hours crept under the dormitory door, two voices in two pieces of black glass building, sentence by sentence, a country with a population of 2. And one night in the deep of December, she said the thing that broke the last restraint between them. "I want to see you." The glass went still in his hands. "I know the rules," she went on quickly, before her own daring could stop her. "I know we're not meant to. But Cenarius, I've spent my whole life with the rules, and they kept me safe, and they kept me alone, and I'm so tired of being safe and alone. I don't need your name. I don't need your house or your history or any of the things the daylight uses to file a person away. I just want to stand in a room with you once, in the dark, and know that you're real. That the warmest thing in this whole cold castle isn't a piece of glass. Just once. Tonight. The astronomy tower. No candles, no light. I'll keep my eyes closed if you want. I only want to know you're there in a body and not just a voice. Please." In the dungeon, Draco Malfoy sat with the glass burning against his palms and his whole divided heart rising into his throat, because here it was, the thing he had wanted past sense and past safety since the first night the charm had handed him her voice. The chance to stand in the dark with her as the only self that had ever been honest, to be near her without the war, to close the impossible distance between his two bodies for the length of one stolen hour in the black of the tower, and the chance to be discovered. Because there was no charm on the dark of the astronomy tower. There was only the size of a person, the cold iron and cedar of him, the particular silence of a particular boy. She would not see his face if there were no light, but she might feel the shape of him and know it. She might hear, beneath the words, the cadence the glass had smoothed. She might reach out a hand in the black and touch the cuff of a sleeve she had pushed an ink pot past that very afternoon, and the two warm rooms would become one room, and the daylight would flood the dark, and he would lose her in the instant he finally held her. Yes, he heard himself say, because the wanting was older and larger than the fear. Yes, tonight, midnight, the astronomy tower, no light. He was there first. He stood in the absolute black at the top of the tower, with the snow ticking against the high windows and the cold coming up through the stone into the soles of his feet. And he had cast every silencing and shadowing charm he knew over himself, muffled the cold iron and cedar to nothing, schooled his breathing, wrapped the dark around himself like a second cloak. And still he knew it was madness. Still he knew that the only safe thing was not to have come. And still he had come, because she had said the warmest thing in this whole cold castle and meant a piece of glass, and he could not let the warmest thing she had ever named be a piece of glass when it could for 1 hour be him. He heard the door. He heard her breath catch as the cold met her. He heard her stop just inside the threshold, and her voice came small and brave into the black. Cenarius? He could not answer. The charm was not on the tower. His true voice would betray him in a syllable. So he did the only thing the dark allowed. He crossed the stone toward her, silent in the shadowing charm, and he stopped an arm's length away, and he let her hear, just barely, the sound of a person breathing in the dark where a moment ago there had been no one. "You're here," she breathed. "You came." A step closer. He could feel the warmth of her now in the freezing dark, the small furnace of her so near, and the wanting in him was a physical pressure, an atmospheric weight that pushed him toward her and held him back at once. She lifted a hand into the black between them. He heard the rustle of her sleeve, and he knew that if he let her hand land on him, she would feel the shape of him, the breadth of a shoulder she saw in daylight, and might know. And he knew too that he could not bear to step out of the reach of the first thing she had reached for in trust in the whole of the cold autumn. So he met her hand with his. In the black, their fingers found each other. Hers were cold from the corridor, and they slid into his, and his were colder still from the long wait on the freezing stone. And for a moment neither of them moved, two hands clasped in absolute darkness at the top of a snow-blind tower. And Hermione made a small sound, not a word, just a soft, broken exhale, the sound of a person who had reached into the dark afraid of finding nothing and had found a hand instead. "You're real," she whispered. "You're warm. You're..." Her thumb moved across his knuckles. Once, the exact gesture he had made to her in the torchlit vestibule weeks before, and he went absolutely still, because surely now, surely she would feel the familiarity of it. Surely the body would tell her what the voice had been forbidden to. But she did not know it. She had given that gesture to him in the dark, and never knew he had given it to her in the light. The two rooms hung a hair's breadth apart and did not touch. She stepped closer. He felt her come, felt the warmth of her arrive against the whole front of him, felt her forehead come to rest against his collarbone, in the black, trusting, a girl who had spent her life being safe and alone, laying the whole weight of her loneliness against the chest of the one person in the castle she would have fled from in the light. Her free hand came up and rested flat against his heart, and he knew she could feel it, the wild hammering of it, and he prayed she would read it as the heart of a stranger and not the heart of the boy she had told to sit with his guilt. "I can hear your heart," she whispered. "It's frightened." He could not speak. He brought his free hand up, slowly, slowly, in the dark, and let it rest against her hair, cradling the back of her head with a tenderness that nearly undid him, and he bent his face to the crown of her head and breathed her in, the bergamot and ink and cold night smell of her, and held the whole of her loneliness against the whole of his secret. And the snow ticked at the windows, and the cold came up through the stone, and for one impossible hour in the absolute dark, the two halves of his divided life closed the distance between them and became, briefly, unbearably, one. And then her hand on his heart began to move. Curious, mapping, the way she mapped everything, up the line of his sternum toward the hollow of his throat, toward the place where, if she went higher, she would reach his jaw, the sharp, carved jaw she had watched gild and unguiled in torchlight, and she would know the shape of it under her fingers as surely as she knew her own name. He caught her hand before it reached his throat. He brought it down, gently, gently, and held it against his chest with both of his, stopping its climb toward the truth, and he felt her go still, felt the question form in her even in the dark. "Why won't you let me touch your face?" And he knew the hour had reached its blade edge, knew that one more inch in any direction, and the dark would break open and pour daylight all over the only honest thing he had ever built. And so he did the only thing left to a man who could not speak and could not let himself be known, and could not bear to lose her. He lifted her caught hand to his mouth in the black and pressed his lips to her cold knuckles, once with everything he could not say, and then he stepped back, out of the warmth, out of her reach, into the shadowing dark, and left her standing alone at the top of the snow-blind tower with the ghost of a kiss on her hand, and the door already whispering shut behind a man she had held against her heart, and would not, for all her cleverness, have been able to name. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark of the dormitory with her knuckles pressed to her own mouth, the knuckles he had kissed, and she felt the cold ghost of his lips there, and the warmth of his chest beneath her hand, and the wild frightened hammering of his heart, and the moment he had caught her hand before it reached his face, and stopped it, gently, and stepped back into the dark, and left her. Why wouldn't he let me touch his face? The question had a shape now, and the shape would not leave her. She had reached for his jaw, and he had stopped her with both hands, as though she had reached for a live wire, as though his face were the one thing in the whole of him that could not survive her fingers. And a person did not guard their face from a stranger. A stranger had nothing to hide in a face. You hid your face from someone who might know it. She lay very still as the thought arranged itself, brick by careful brick, the way she arranged everything. He knew her. He had always seemed to know her. Why does it feel as though you knew me before the glass? And he had answered with that careful misdirection about her teaching him, and she had let it lie because she had her own locked rooms. He had known the shape of her terrible thing in the library without her naming it. Whatever you did yesterday. He had spoken of a person he saw every day who thought he was her enemy. He had spoken of a father who taught him that to be loved, he had to be untouchable, pure, perfect. And she had felt the words land in her with a terrible familiarity she had refused to follow, because the face they fit was a face she could not bear to fit them to. She sat up in the dark. No, she told herself. No. You're building a person out of fear again, the way you built one out of him. You're seeing patterns because you want there to be patterns. Cenarius could be anyone. Half the boys in this castle had fathers who taught them cruelty was strength. Half of them think themselves your enemy. You are reaching for the most painful possible answer because some broken part of you would rather be betrayed than be loved by accident. It was a good argument. It was an accurate one, even. And it held, the way her arguments held, right up until the moment it didn't. Because the next morning at breakfast, she lifted her eyes across the great hall, almost against her will, to the Slytherin table, to the place where Draco Malfoy sat with his coffee untouched and the half-moons dark under his eyes. And he looked up at the exact same moment, as though he had felt the weight of her gaze the way the dark man always felt the weather of her. And their eyes met across the whole length of the hall. And he looked away, fast, the way a man looks away from a thing he cannot afford to be caught looking at. And she felt her own heart do something violent and unwilling in her chest. And she put her fork down because her hand was not steady. No, she told herself again. But the brick was laid. She did what she always did with a question she could not bear. She investigated it in order to disprove it. She told herself this was the rational thing, to gather the evidence, to test the dreadful hypothesis against the facts, and to watch it collapse, as it surely would, and to be free of it. She told herself she was steering toward the truth, when in fact every careful step she took was a step she had chosen because it led away, and her cleverness, which had never once failed her, became in that week the most willing accomplice her fear had ever recruited. She studied the timing. Cenarius came to the glass each night near midnight. But so, she reasoned, did half the castle keep late hours. It proved nothing. She listened to the cadence of the altered voice and tried to lay it over the daylight voices she knew. But the charm had done its work too well, and she could not honestly say the smoothed-down rhythm of the dark belonged to anyone. It belonged to no one. That was the whole point of it. She noted that Cenarius spoke of warding, of arithmancy, of the precise music of stone. But so did she. Constantly, she had probably taught him half of it through the glass. It proved nothing. And every time the evidence threatened to point at the one face she could not bear, she found the flaw in it, the reasonable doubt, the alternative reading, because she was Hermione Granger, and she could find the flaw in anything. And she turned that terrible gift entirely to the work of not knowing what she already, in the deep silt of herself, knew. Once she came close, dangerously close. It was in the arithmancy tower, an ordinary evening, the orrery ticking, and Malfoy had been quiet and careful all session. And at the end, as he gathered his diagrams, he said, almost to himself, looking at the slate-dark window, "The eastern anchor's holding now. The new stones learned to sing with the old. It only needed someone to stop demanding it be what it was before. And something in the phrasing, the cadence of it, the particular grave gentleness, landed in her exactly as the dark man's words had landed. Maybe the wall was the lie, and the man holding your hand is what was always underneath. And for one vertiginous second the two rooms swung toward each other, and she felt the flaw of her certainty drop away. And Malfoy looked up and caught her staring, and his face did something she had never seen it do, a flicker of raw open hope so quickly buried that she might have imagined it, and he said roughly, "What? Have I grown a second head, Granger?" And the daylight war snapped back into place around them like a reflex, and she said something cutting, and he said something colder, and the two rooms swung apart again, and she walked back to Gryffindor, telling herself she had imagined the whole thing. She climbed the fourth-floor staircase. The mended step held under her foot. She did not notice. That night she nearly asked him. She lay with the glass warm in her hands, and Cenarius's low voice in the dark, and the dreadful brick-built hypothesis sitting in her chest like a stone. And she opened her mouth a dozen times to say it. "Are you someone I know? Are you someone I see? Are you the person I think you are and cannot bear to think you are?" And a dozen times she closed it, because she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that she did not want the answer. As long as the questions stayed unasked, the dark room and the daylight war could stay in their separate countries, and she could keep the one warm thing she had without having to reconcile it with the one thing she had spent 6 years learning to hate. "You're far away tonight," Cenarius said. "I can hear you not saying something. You do that, you know. You go quiet in a particular way when there's a question you've decided not to ask. I've learned the sound of it." "There's no question," she lied. "All right," he said gently, and let her keep it, as he always let her keep her locked rooms. And then, after a silence with texture, "Sortis, the other night, in the dark, when you reached for me and I stopped your hand." She went very still. "I've been afraid you'd think I didn't want, that I was rejecting. I need you to know it was the opposite. I stopped your hand because if you'd touched my face, you'd have known me. And I'm not ready for you to know me, and I was a coward about it, and I'm sorry. But it wasn't that I didn't want your hands on me. There has never in my life been anything I wanted more than your hands on me. Do you understand? I stepped back to protect a secret, not to push you away. The stepping back nearly killed me. In the dungeon 3 floors below, Draco said it and meant every syllable. And he held his breath after, because it was the closest he had ever come to the edge of the truth. You'd have known me. And he waited to see whether she would seize it, whether her terrible cleverness would close around the opening and pull, and the wall and the dark would finally crash together. And Hermione, lying in the candlelight with the brick-built stone in her chest, heard "You'd have known me," and felt the floor drop away a second time, felt the whole dreadful hypothesis surge up toward the surface. And she pushed it back down with both hands, because she could not bear to be right. And she said instead, in a voice that shook only slightly, "Then let me know you. Not your face, not yet, but tell me one thing that's true in the daylight too. One thing that's the same in both your worlds. so that when I finally see you, I'll have something to recognize. It was, she understood even as she said it, a coward's compromise. She was asking for the truth in a form small enough to survive, a single fact she could carry without having to face the whole face it belonged to. And in the dungeon, Draco understood it too, understood that she was circling the truth and steering away from it at once, that some part of her knew and some part of her had forbidden the knowing, and that he held in his hands the power to end the circling with a single sentence. He chose the most dangerous true thing he dared. In the daylight, he said slowly, I'm cruel to the person I love most, because I learned cruelty before I learned anything else, and it's still the first language my mouth reaches for when I'm frightened. The same as you, Sortis. You told me once you were crueler to him because you'd begun to care, that the caring was a threat you had to put down. I'm the same. When I'm most afraid of how much I want someone, I reach for the blade. We're alike in that. We both learned to guard the soft place by being the first to strike it. A pause. That's true in both my worlds. The cruelty and the wanting living in the same hand. If you're ever going to recognize me, recognize that. And Hermione lay in the candlelight and felt the words go into her like cold water down the spine. We're alike in that, the cruelty and the wanting in the same hand, the same as you. And the brick-built hypothesis rose one final time toward the surface of her, complete now, fully assembled, wearing at last the face she had refused for a week to let it wear. The face across the contested table, the bent feather, the hand that had held hers in the torchlit dark like a thing he loved and had no right to. The boy who had taken a punishment that wasn't his and said, I have a name to bury. And she opened her mouth in the dark to say the name, to finally say it, to end the circling and let the two countries crash together whatever the cost. And the words died in her throat, because saying it would make it real, and she was not ready for it to be real. And so she said only in a whisper so small the charm nearly lost it, I think I might already recognize you. And on the other end of the glass, 3 floors below, the boy who loved her heard it and went absolutely, terribly still. Neither of them spoke for a long moment after. I think I might already recognize you. The sentence hung in the dark between the 2 glasses, and each of them turned it over in terror. She afraid of what she had nearly admitted to herself. He afraid of what she had nearly admitted to him. And in the end, it was he who stepped back from the edge first, because he had been stepping back from edges his whole life and knew the footwork. Then hold what you recognize gently, he said. Whatever it is, whoever, don't let the daylight tell you it can't be true. The daylight lies about people, Sortis. It only ever shows you the armor. A pause. Sleep now. You've been awake too many nights. I can hear it in you. She let him send her to sleep because she did not have the courage to keep the conversation on the cliff edge any longer either, and the 2 of them retreated into the safe dark with the truth lying unspoken between them like a sword laid down the middle of a bed, present, gleaming, untouched. But it would not stay unspoken. Things that large never do. They only wait for the daylight to force the hand. The daylight forced it 3 days before the end of term. The east wing lattice, the great arithmantic ward they had built together, brick of figures by brick of figures, through all the careful and uncareful weeks, was to be set live. McGonagall came to witness it, and a ministry warding inspector with a clipboard and a sour mouth, and the thing had to hold, or the whole East Wing would be condemned for another winter. It was their work, the two of them, the contested table made manifest in stone and number, and it came down to a single binding incantation that had to be spoken by both of them at once. In unison, their wands crossed at the eastern anchor, their voices threaded into one. They stood at the anchor stone in the cold December light, the inspector watching, McGonagall watching, the new stone and the old waiting to be told to sing together. And Malfoy raised his wand, and Hermione raised hers, and they crossed them at the point of binding, and his hand came alongside hers on the cold stone, close, the cold iron and cedar of him near enough to breathe. And McGonagall said, "Together then, on 3, and counted, and on 3 they spoke the incantation as one. And his voice, his true voice, his daylight voice, unsmoothed by any charm, threaded directly into hers in the unison of the binding, so close she felt it in her own chest more than heard it. His voice spoke the words in the exact cadence of the dark. She had never heard him this way. In 6 years of war, she had only ever heard him strike. The drawl, the sneer, the flat cruelty, the armour of the voice. She had never once heard Draco Malfoy speak something he meant, gently, in earnest, the words chosen and set down with grave care, because he had never once done it in her hearing in the daylight. But the binding required earnestness. It required the true intent threaded clean. And so, for the length of a single incantation, he spoke without armour, in the cadence he used only in the dark, the careful, precise gravity of a man walking a frozen lake. And Hermione's wand wavered in her hand, and the words faltered on her own lips, because she knew that cadence. She had fallen asleep to that cadence for 2 months. She had held it against her own heart at the top of a snow-blind tower, and the 2 countries she had kept so carefully apart slammed together in the space of a single shared breath, with a force that emptied the air from her lungs. The binding caught despite her faltering, caught and flared gold along the seam of new stone and old, the lattice waking, the ward setting live, the east wing saved. But Hermione did not see it. She had turned her head, very slowly, to look at the boy whose wand was still crossed with hers, and whose voice was still dying away in the cold air in the cadence of the man she loved in the dark. And she was staring at him with her whole stricken face open, and he felt the weight of her stare and turned, and saw that she knew. He saw it land in her. He saw the daylight flood the dark in her eyes, saw the 2 rooms become 1 room, saw her look at him, at Malfoy, at the enemy of 6 years, at the bent feather and the buried name and the hand that had held hers, and recognize, all at once and too late and irreversibly, the warm voice in the black, the heart that had hammered, frightened under her palm, the lips that had pressed her knuckles in the dark and stepped away. He saw her understand that the person she had hated most and the person she had loved most were one divided creature standing across one anchor stone with his wand crossed against hers. And he did the only thing he could. He lowered his wand and he stepped back and he said, for the inspector, for McGonagall, for the daylight that had to keep being held up around them, In the old flat armoured voice, the drawl reassembled over the wound. "Ward's live. We're done here." And he turned and walked away across the cold stone, his footsteps hollow, leaving her standing at the anchor of the thing they had built together, with the gold light of it fading along the seam, and the whole catastrophic truth blooming open in her chest, where the brick-built hypothesis had sat so long unspoken. She did not call after him. She could not. The inspector was saying something, ticking something on his clipboard. McGonagall was saying something about fine work, about both of them, about the value of unlikely partnership. And Hermione stood and nodded and made the shapes of a person receiving praise, while inside her the dark room and the daylight war finished crashing together and left nothing standing, left her with the unbearable, total, irreversible knowledge she had spent a week steering away from, now arrived all at once with no mercy in it. Cenarius is Malfoy. The voice in the dark is the enemy in the light. I love the person I have spent 6 years learning to hate, and I have been loving him for 2 months, and he has known the whole time. He has known since the first night, and he let me. He let me reach for him. He let me lay my loneliness against his chest. He kissed my hand in the dark and never told me whose mouth it was. The last thought arrived with a heat that was almost rage and almost grief, and she could not yet tell the two apart. She did not go to the glass that night. She held it in her hands in the dark of the dormitory, and she could not lift it to her mouth, because the voice that would answer was a voice with a face now, and the face was the one across the contested table. And every gentle thing the dark had ever said to her had been said by the boy who had once stood in a corridor and called her a slur, and she did not know how to hold both of those at once. The dark man had told her, weeks ago, in his own divided way, "Would you go back and unhear everything I've said? Would you call it all a trick?" And she had told him she couldn't unhear it, that you couldn't unknow a person once they'd let you in. He had been asking her, she understood now, with the whole of his fear, "When you find out it's me, will you call our entire dark a lie?" He had been preparing the ground for this exact ruin since the very beginning, and the glass warmed in her hands. He was reaching for her. Near midnight, the heat bloomed against her palms, the way it had every night for 2 months, and his voice came up out of the black, careful, terrified, the cadence she could never again pretend not to know. "Sortis, please, I know you know. I felt you know. Please don't leave me in the dark alone. Say something, anything, even if it's the blade. I'd rather the blade than the silence." She held the glass and did not speak. Her hand shook around it. "I should have told you the first night," he said into her silence, the words spilling now, the dam gone. "I knew it was you in 3 sentences. The fairness, the way you offered to learn a language with me. No one else in the world talks the way you talk. I knew, and I should have requested another partner, and I didn't, because you were speaking to me as though I were a blank page you might write something gentle on, and no one had ever. Sortis, no one had ever. And I told myself one night, just one, where you didn't know to hate me. And then it was 2 months, and every gentle thing was real. I swear to you on the only thing I have left to swear on, every word in the dark was the truest thing I've ever said to anyone. The lie was never the words. The lie was only the name. I only ever hid the name. And Hermione, sitting in the dark with the glass burning in her shaking hand, and the tears finally coming, hot and silent, and furious and grieving all at once, lifted it at last to her mouth, and spoke into it the only thing she had, the blade he had said he would rather have than the silence, the cruelty that was, as it had always been with her. The first language her mouth reached for when she was most afraid of how much she wanted someone. "You let me hold you," she said, her voice breaking on it. "You let me lay everything down against your chest. And the whole time you were the one person in this castle I'd have run from, and you knew it, and you let me anyway. How am I ever supposed to trust a single word you said in the dark, when the man who said them spent 6 years teaching me exactly how much he despised everything I am? And in the dungeon 3 floors below, the boy who loved her took the blade he had asked for, and let it go all the way in, and did not raise a hand to block it. For a long moment the dark gave her nothing back. She thought he had gone, thought she had finally driven him off for good, the way she had driven him from the tower in the autumn, the silence stretching until it had a temperature. And some part of her, the part that had built a person out of fear for 6 years, felt the old, terrible comfort begin to settle. There, you've put it down, the threat is gone, you know where to stand again. But he had not gone. When his voice came, it was stripped to nothing, the charm unable to smooth the rawness out of it any longer, a voice with no armour left at all. "You're right," he said. "Every word. I did despise everything you are, or I told myself I did, because everything you are was everything my father taught me to fear. That a person could be brilliant and brave and good without a single drop of the blood he'd told me was the only thing that made a person worth anything. You frightened me before I ever hated you. The hating came after, because hating was easier than letting you be the proof that everything I'd been built to believe was a lie. So, yes, I taught you exactly how much I despised you, and I meant it the way a frightened child means it, which is to say I meant the fear and dressed it as contempt. A breath, ragged. And then the glass handed me your voice with no face attached, no house, no surname, no daylight to dress my fear in, and I had nothing left to hate you with. There was just you. The mind I'd been taught to fear, speaking to me gently. And I found out, Sortis, that with the fear stripped off, what was underneath it was never hate at all. It was this. It was always going to be this. I think I've been in love with you since before I knew the word for it, since back when I only knew how to throw stones at the thing I couldn't stop looking at. Hermione sat in the dark with the tears running and the glass burning, and could not speak. "I'm not going to defend the hiding," he went on. "There's no defense. You reached for me, and I let you, knowing you'd have run, and that was a theft. And I knew it was a theft every single night, and I did it anyway, because I was starving, and you were the only warmth in the world. You can call that whatever you need to call it. I'll wear it. But I won't let you believe the words were the lie. The words were the only true thing I have ever done. In the daylight, I'm a coward in armour. In the dark, with you, I was finally a person. You did that, not the charm. You. And if you never speak to me again in either world, I will still have been for 2 months more myself than I was in the whole rest of my life, because of you, and I would not give that back to be spared this. I'd rather have this, the blade, the silence, the losing you, than never have stood in the dark and been known. A pause, and then, so low the charm nearly lost it. I forgave you for the library before you'd finished saying it. I want you to know that. The blade in daylight never touched the man in the dark, because I understood it. We strike the soft place first, you and I. It's the thing we have most in common. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm only asking you not to unmake what was real. Hate me in the daylight if you have to, but don't make our dark a lie. It's the only honest place I've ever lived. And then the glass went cool. He had ended it himself this time. Not to wound, she understood, but to give her the silence to decide in, to take his own voice out of the room so that whatever she chose, she would choose without him pressing on the scale. She sat alone in the dark with the cooling glass and wept, and could not tell for a long time whether she was weeping for the loss of the enemy or the loss of the beloved, until she understood, finally, sometime near dawn, that they were the same loss and the same person, and that the thing breaking in her was not her trust, but the wall, the 6 years built wall, the careful cartography of contempt, the whole architecture she had raised to know where to stand, coming down at last, brick by brick, in the dark, with no one to see it fall. She did not sleep. As the window went from black to the bruised grey of a winter dawn, she sat with the dead glass in her hands and made herself do the thing she had refused to do for a week. She let the 2 rooms be one room, and she walked through it, and she looked at everything in it without flinching. The bent feather in the library, when the boy had said his uncle didn't come home, and Cenarius, that same night, whatever you did yesterday, you didn't deserve to reach into the dark and find no one there. One grief in one body. The punishment taken in McGonagall's office, I have a name to bury. And Cenarius. There's a person I see every day who doesn't know she's the reason I'm still trying. One sacrifice, one secret, one divided creature. The hand held in the torchlit vestibule, the thumb across her knuckles, and the same gesture given back to her in the dark of the tower, her own gesture, returned to her by a man she'd thought a stranger. The same hands, the same care, the cruelty, and the wanting living in the same hand, exactly as he'd told her. If you're ever going to recognize me, recognize that. He had been telling her the truth for 2 months, in the only language that let him tell it. He had hidden the name, and hidden nothing else. And the staircase. She thought, near the end, of the 4th floor staircase she climbed every night to the arithmancy tower. And she remembered suddenly a morning weeks ago when she had heard a younger student complain of a false step there that had nearly dropped her, a step the castle hadn't flagged. And she remembered that her own step had never once faltered on those stairs, not once, all autumn. She did not know how she knew, but she knew. She knew the way you know a thing in the silt of yourself before you have the evidence for it, that he had mended it, that he had knelt on the cold stone in the dark after curfew with a binding charm so that the girl who despised him would not fall, that he had been loving her in 100 invisible ways she would never be able to trace, taking no credit because the credit required a name, and the name was the one thing that would have turned every kindness into a weapon aimed at her trust. He had spent the whole autumn protecting her from everything, from Theo's jokes and bleeding ink and treacherous stares, including, most of all, from himself, from the knowledge of who was loving her. He had stood between her and his own face, like a man holding a door against a flood. And she had told him she could never trust a word he said. Hermione set down the glass. The dawn had come up grey and cold over the snow, and the castle was beginning to wake, and term ended in 3 days. And she did not have 3 days. She did not have one, because she understood now that the silence she had left him in was not a clean wound that would close. It was the exact silence he had spent his whole life being left in, that no one ever reached for me in the dark, and she had reached for him for 2 months. And then, the instant she learned his name, taken her hand away. She got up. She did not change her crumpled robes, or tame her hair, or arm herself in any of the ways she armed herself. She went out into the grey corridor with the dead glass in her pocket and her heart going like a hammer, and she walked past the pale new stone and the old, down the 4th floor staircase, whose mended step held firm and silent under her foot, his step, his quiet, unclaimed gift. And she did not know exactly where she was going until she was going there, down toward the cold green hush of the dungeons where she had no right to be and had never once set foot, to find the one person in the castle she had spent 6 years learning to flee. She found him before the dungeons. He was in the entrance hall, alone in the grey dawn light, dressed for the cold with his trunk beside him and his face the colour of ash. And he was not waiting for her. He had clearly not expected her, had clearly meant to be gone before the castle woke, to spare them both the daylight. And when he saw her come down the great stair toward him, he went absolutely still, the way he went still in the dark when she said something that reached past his armour, and his hand tightened on the handle of his trunk until the knuckles whitened. "Granger," he said, and the daylight voice was there, the armour reassembled, flat and careful. "I'm leaving early. McGonagall's released me. You won't have to—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. She crossed the last of the cold stone floor toward him and stopped an arm's length away, the exact distance of the dark tower, the distance he had put between them every time he stepped back to protect the secret. And she looked up into the ash-grey face of the boy she had hated and the man she had loved, both of them at once now, one divided creature standing with his trunk in the grey dawn, braced for the blade. "You mended the staircase," she said. Her voice was not steady. "The 4th floor, the false step. You knelt down in the dark and mended it so I wouldn't fall, and you never told me, because telling me would have meant telling me your name." It was not a question. "How many other things did you do that I never saw?" He said nothing. The whitening of the knuckles, the jaw working, the whole armoured daylight self holding itself together by force against the thing rising in him. "Answer me," she said, and her voice broke clean down the middle. "In the dark, you'd answer me. Answer me here. In the daylight, just once. How many?" And Draco Malfoy looked at her standing there in her crumpled robes, with her wild hair and her broken voice, having come down into the dungeons she'd never set foot in to ask him this. And the armour he had spent his whole life building came apart all at once, and he answered her in the daylight, in the cadence of the dark, the 2 voices finally, one voice The 2 rooms, finally, 1 room. All of them, Granger. Every one I could reach. From the first night, I knew it was you. All of them. The words hung in the cold grey hall between them. All of them. Every one I could reach. From the first night, I knew it was you. And the entrance hall held its breath, the way the dark glass had held its silences, with texture, waited, waiting. Hermione looked at him, at the ash of his face and the whitened knuckles on the trunk handle, and the eyes that had finally, in the daylight, stopped pretending. And she understood that she was standing at the last anchor stone of the whole autumn, the binding that would either catch and flare gold along the seam of new and old, or fail and leave the east wing of her to be condemned for another winter, and that the incantation this time had to be spoken by her alone. "For 2 months," she said, and her voice shook, "I have fallen asleep to a voice in the dark. I told that voice things I've never told Harry, never told Ron, never told anyone. I laid my whole loneliness down against a chest I couldn't see, and I felt a heart hammering under my hand, and I thought, there, finally, the one warm thing in this cold place. And the worst day of my life was 3 days ago, when I found out the warm thing had your face on it." She drew a breath that scraped. "Because I had a whole architecture built, Malfoy. 6 years of it, brick by brick. Every cruel thing you ever did, mortared into a wall I knew exactly how to stand behind. And you've spent this entire autumn coming out from behind that wall, in the daylight and the dark at once, in 2 voices with 2 names, until there's no wall left. You've taken it down with your own hands, one invisible kindness at a time, and you didn't even let me watch you do it. You mended my staircase in the dark so I wouldn't fall, and then you let me believe I never trusted you, when the truth is, I've trusted you with everything for 2 months. I just didn't know your name. Granger, I'm not finished." Her hands were shaking. She let them shake. "You said in the dark that you'd rather have the blade than the silence, and I gave you the blade. I told you I could never trust a word you said. And then I left you in the exact silence you'd spent your whole life being left in, the silence where no one reaches back. And I've spent every hour since understanding that I did to you in 3 days what your father spent 18 years doing. I taught you that the moment someone learns who you really are, they take their hand away." She was crying now, openly, furiously, the tears running unwiped. "And I won't. Do you hear me? I take it back. The blade. All of it. I won't be one more person who reached for you in the dark and let go the instant there was light enough to see your face." He had gone very still. The trunk handle slipped from his fingers, and the trunk settled to the stone with a soft sound, and he stared at her as though she was speaking a language he had heard of but never dared learn. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, very low. "Granger, Hermione, you're tired, you haven't slept, you're grieving the loss of a stranger, and you've confused it with... Don't." She took a step toward him, closing the arm's length, the dark tower distance, the distance he had always kept. "Don't do the thing you always do. Don't step back to protect me from you. I'm done being protected from you. I want the man who mended my staircase. I want the voice in the dark and the face in the daylight, and I want them to be the same person, which they are, which they have been the whole time, and the only one who couldn't bear it was me, and I'm bearing it now. Look at me. I'm bearing it." "You hated me," he said, and his own voice broke at last, the armor gone entirely, the raw thing underneath finally in the open in the daylight. "An hour ago, you told me you could never trust me. People don't—" He stopped. His hands had come up, helpless, halfway to her and held back. "People don't turn that fast. It isn't real. It's the shock. Tomorrow you'll wake up and it'll be Malfoy standing here, just Malfoy, and you'll remember every stone I ever threw, and you'll be glad I left, and I cannot. Hermione, I cannot survive being reached for and let go a second time. So, if you don't mean it, if there's any part of you that will wake up tomorrow and pull your hand back, take it back now. Now, while I can still get on the train. Be cruel now, the way we both know how, and let me go." And Hermione Granger, who had spent 6 years learning where to stand against this boy, who had built a wall and a war and a whole cartography of contempt, looked at the man who was begging her to be cruel, because cruelty was the only thing he had ever been able to believe was real. And she did the one thing in the world he could not have braced for. She closed the last of the distance, and she lifted both her cold hands, and she laid them against his face, against the sharp carved jaw she had reached for in the dark and been forbidden to touch, the jaw he had caught her hand to keep from knowing. And she held his face the way she had wanted to hold it at the top of the snow-blind tower, and she felt him go rigid and then shudder under her palms like something breaking open, and she said, "I'm touching your face, in the daylight, with your name, and I'm not letting go." He made a sound she had never heard from him, a sound with no armor anywhere in it, and his hands came up at last and closed over hers where they framed his face, not to pull them away this time, but to hold them there, to press them harder against him, as though we could not get them close enough, as though he had been cold for 18 years and had only just found the fire. And the grey dawn came through the high windows and laid its thin light along the line of their joined hands, and the castle woke slowly around them, and the snow ticked at the glass. "Say it in the daylight," she whispered. "The thing you said in the dark, the one true thing. Say it with your real voice to my real face." And Draco Malfoy, holding her hands against his face in the cold light of the last morning of term, said it in the cadence that had always been his true one, the careful, grave, gentle voice he had only ever found in the dark, now finally spoken in the light. "I love you. I've loved you since before I had the courage to stop throwing stones. I loved you in the dark when you didn't know my name, and I loved you in the daylight when you despised me. And I will love you tomorrow, when the shock has worn off, and it's just my face and your memory of every cruel thing I ever did, and I will still be standing here, and I will still mean it. I love you, Hermione Granger. That's the one true thing. It was always the one true thing." She rose up onto her toes, her hands still framing his face, and she closed the final breath of distance that had stood between them since the first night the glass warmed, and she kissed him. It was not a careful kiss. It was the whole of 2 months and 6 years let go at once, the blade and the wanting finally living in the same mouth, and he made that broken sound again against her lips. And then his arms came around her completely, gathering her up the way he had gathered her in the dark of the tower. and she felt the wild hammering of his heart against her, exactly where she had felt it that night, with her palm flat to his chest. Frightened, the heart of a man who could not believe the warmth was for him, and she kissed him until the frightened hammering slowed, until it steadied, until he believed it, and the grey dawn turned gold along the eastern windows where the saved wing of the castle had learned, at last, to sing its new stone and its old stone into one song. When they broke apart, they did not go far. He pressed his forehead to hers, both of them breathing hard, and she felt him laugh. A real laugh, disbelieving, wet at the edges. And he said, against her mouth, "You came down into the dungeons. You've never set foot in the dungeons in your life." "I came to find the warmest thing in the castle," she said. "I knew where it was, finally. And the train. You're not getting on the train." She drew back just enough to look at him, her hands sliding from his face to his chest, to the place where his heart had finally steadied under her touch. "We have an east wing to keep standing, and I have 2 months of conversations to have over again, in the daylight, to your actual face, now that I know whose voice I've been falling asleep to." She paused, and something of the old fire came back into her, but warm now, turned toward him instead of against him. "And the next time you decide to protect me from yourself by stepping back into the dark, Malfoy, I'm going to follow you in. I've gotten very good at finding you in the dark. You taught me how." He looked at her for a long moment, at Hermione Granger standing in the dungeons she'd never entered, in her crumpled robes, with her hands on his chest, and the dawn in her wild hair, having come down through the whole sleeping castle to take back a blade and give him a kiss instead. And the last of the ash went out of his face, and what was underneath it, the thing his father had told him to bury, the thing only she had ever reached for in the dark, came up into the daylight at last and stayed. "All right," he said softly. "The daylight then, both of us. No more names hidden, no more walls, no more stepping back." He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm. Once, the gesture from the dark tower, the kiss on the knuckles given again now where she could see it, where she could finally know whose mouth it was. "Though I should warn you, I'm still cruel before I'm kind when I'm frightened. It's the first language my mouth reaches for. You'll have to be patient with the accent." "I know," she said, and smiled against him, and it was the smile she had never once given him in 6 years of war. "We're alike in that, the cruelty and the wanting in the same hand. You told me to recognize you by it." She closed her hand around his, the two of them threaded together the way their voices had threaded in the binding, new stone and old learning at last to be one. "I recognize you, in the dark and the daylight both. I always will now." Outside, the snow had stopped. The grey had gone gold, and then pale, clear blue, and the rebuilt castle stood whole in the new light, its pale new stone and its old dark stone holding each other up the way they had been charmed to, the wound and the healing reconciled at last, singing one song. And in the entrance hall, 2 people who had spent 6 years learning to stand against each other stood instead together, hand in hand, having found in the end that hatred and love had never been opposite countries at all, but only 2 names for the same fierce attention, and that the enemy she had loved without knowing it and the beloved she had hated without meaning to had been from the very first night the dark glass warmed, one whole person, finally in the daylight, with both his names hers.
Thank you for staying with this story until the end. I want to tell you why I wrote it. We all wear masks. We show the world our armor. We hide the soft part of us because we are afraid. We think that if people see who we really are, they will leave. Draco believed this his whole life. He thought law was only for people who were perfect, so he threw stones. He was cruel first before anyone could hurt him, but in the dark, with no name and no face, he could finally be honest. And Hermione lowered that honest voice long before she knew whose voice it was. There is a moment I keep thinking about. She put her hands on his face and says, I am touching your face in the daylight with your name and I am not letting go. That is the whole story in one line. She chose to stay even after she saw everything. I think we are all waiting for that, for someone to see our real face and not let go. So here is what I hope you take with you. The person you are in the dark when no one is watching, that person is worth loving too. Maybe even more. Be a little braver. Take off the mask first. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next story.